All right, guys, good morning. I told you I was going to bring it this week, so I'm not going to disappoint. This paper, this paper is why you keep very smart friends among you. I called a buddy of mine, another neurodoc, and told him what I was talking about this week, and he says, "Oh man, I have the perfect paper for you." And he dug through his archives and he found this for me. And as you can see, straight up relationship between the brain and immune systems. This is super cool. I'm going to go through and talk about a little bit of this. Ready, go. All right. This is one of the coolest charts in this paper. And as you can kind of see over here, it's a long paper, right? What this is showing you is what your brain's response is, or I should say, what the downstream immune system's response is to either a lesion or stimulation of that area of your brain, all right? And obviously, these are in experimentally created scenarios, right, situations, but we can very easily adapt this and kind of talk about what this really means for us kind of in real life, right? So let's just start here looking at the neocortex, okay? So we know the neocortex is your frontal lobe, okay? And if we look at this where it says a left side lesion, so what they did was they took and created a lesion, right? Created dysfunction in the person's left hemisphere of their frontal lobe. And what did they see? They saw decreased T cell function and decreased T cell function and number. So again, what is that? Your T cells are what present antigens to B cells to antibodies, antibodies, right? So essentially, you're going to have decreased antibody creation, right? So decreased Th2 or antibody-mediated immunity, okay? On the flip side, right, if you create a right-sided lesion over here, what are you going to get? Increased T cell function, right? So increased antibody immunity. So what does that mean? It means that someone with a right-sided lesion, right, would have a higher propensity of developing allergies. Does that make sense? Okay. And let's put this in the perspective of a group of individuals that have imbalanced left and right-sided cortical function, right? And for me, that always comes back to autism or ADHD, okay? And I say that because if any of you have read Disconnected Kids, they really base their therapeutic modality on the idea of hemisphericity, right? So you'll typically see someone who's ADHD that has a super high left side of their brain. They're super analytical, they're really book smart, but they're depressed on the right side of their brain, which is the emotional area, right? Or the abstract thought and that sort of stuff. And guess what? Those kids tend to have more food allergies, right? And environmental allergies, that sort of stuff. That's something for a whole other discussion. But I want to look at this from the perspective of, again, like we talked about yesterday, what happens if someone has a right neck and shoulder issue that persists for years, right? So remember, the right side of your neck and shoulder, it's the left side of your cortex, right? So if you have dysfunction where spinal segments are not moving properly or we don't have the right posture, that's decreased stimulus to the left side of your cortex and is therefore going to influence your immune system's activity, right? So I want to this is kind of the next chart that's in the paper, and we're not going to talk about the hypothalamus. When I saw this chart, it reminded me of sitting at a blackjack table in Vegas, and Brian were playing blackjack, and he just keeps drawing cards and drawing cards and drawing cards. I think he split a pair of deuces or something crazy. And the dealer just keeps dealing cards and dealing cards and dealing cards. And next thing you know, he has a whole pile of cards, like 8 cards, and he hasn't busted 21, to the point where none of us can keep up with the math. And literally the dealer says, well, that's a mess. And that's what the hypothalamus is. The hypothalamus is a mess. So we are not going to talk about that today. We are going to focus, guess what, on the lowest portion of this chart, on the cerebellum, okay? And this is the last thing I want to talk about. And really, it's just this area of the vestibulocerebellum, okay? Because your vestibulocerebellum is the portion of your cerebellum that is most involved in posture, okay? There's an entire descending neurological system called your vestibulospinal tract that is your postural reflex system, okay? And like this says here, if we develop a lesion in your vestibulocerebellum, it leads to decreased cytokine release, so leukocyte number and antibody response. So if we have decreased leukocyte number and decreased antibody response, what does that look like? That's a global Th1 and Th2 suppression. Okay? Again, let me say that again. If we have a problem with our postural system, we're going to develop decreased leukocyte number, so decreased white blood cell numbers, okay, and a decreased antibody response. So this is yet another paper that backs up exactly what I talked about day one, right, about having a systemic immune suppression if you have a localized musculoskeletal injury. And doctors, how many people come in with only one complaint? Virtually none. I would argue less than 5% of people come in and only have one complaint. So we're getting global suppression of the immune function times 2, times 3, times 4, however many different complaints that they have. It just gets worse and worse and worse every single time. So today, let's go beyond the musculoskeletal. Let's go beyond the basic chiropractic, and let's talk about how impactful what it is that we do actually is.